Super speed is not a real superpower, and most characters who have this power aren't actually using super speed at all. Let's talk about it. So to start, there are three main components of super speed. I guess the fundamental principle of super speed, as in, if you were to break down super speed, you could break it down into these three parts. First of all, if you have super speed, you need to have the ability to process the fact that you're in super speed. This essentially means that when you're using your super speed, you need to be aware of the fact that you're using this power so that you don't start crashing into obstacles. Secondly, you need to have the ability to actually control your speed, which pretty much means that you can go from 0 kilometers per hour to whatever your top speed is. This requirement relates more so towards how you actually got your powers. So for some it'd be the speed force, for some they might be born with it. And then thirdly, you need to have a body which can actually facilitate your speed. So this relates to things like durability. Now, if you actually combine these three things together, you would get super speed as a resulting power, right? But to basically present my argument, I will show that if you actually go through each of these points one by one, you will realize that the power that you get as the result is actually not super speed, but a superset of super speed.
This is going to work if I can't hold your interest through one conversation.
Hold my interest? Olga, please. You can't see things how I do. My perception is just as fast as I am.
Okay, so first of all, I want you guys to consider this graph. So basically, right, we have a blue dot, right? And this blue dot represents your character who has super speed. And then we have like an y-axis with numbers going from 0 onwards. Now this is a model for speed. So basically to the left you would have 0 kilometers per hour, so basically resting speed. And to the right we would have like your character's top speed, so whatever that would be. It could be like a 10,000 kilometers, Mach 1, the speed of light, faster than the speed of light, whatever that would be. It doesn't really matter. Now, since the blue dot basically represents your character, what you can do is that you can drag the blue dot from left to right, and when you do that, your character speed changes. And this is pretty much what's happening when you are thinking about a character who has super speed, right? Like you think about the Flash, he's kind of like, standing still doing jack all, right? And then I guess a threat happens and he wants to go super fast. Then you can imagine that the blue dot, if you think that it represents him, it would start moving from left to right. Now this is not complete because there's still one more thing you can add to this, and that would be the limit. And this limit is basically the speed at which you think super speed starts, as in like what is a cutoff speed in fiction for what speed qualifies as super speed. This is a bit hard for me to answer since we're dealing with fiction, right? And it's hard for me to sit here and think about every single speedster in the world and like average out the speed to arrive at a number, right? Because that's just impossible. Unless I was like God and I just knew every single series in the world which has speedster characters, right? This is kind of impossible. So to keep things simple, let's just say that the limit is 100 kilometers per hour. This pretty much means that in fiction, if you're going at a speed below 100 kilometers per hour, you don't have super speed. But if you go above it, then yeah, okay, you have super speed. Now, if you just take everything that I said so far, what you just created is pretty much what you can call a model of super speed. As in like when people are talking about super speed, this is pretty much what is actually happening inside of it. So if you go back to the Flash example, you can I guess have him stand still and do nothing at all, right? But I guess some danger happens and he needs to save this one guy, so he revs himself up, or I guess he taps into the speed force, and then he can go from 0 kilometers per hour to whatever speed he wants to I guess save the day. And when he passes a limit threshold, then we can say that he has entered super speed territory. But even though I said that this model is complete, I was lying. So I just lied to you guys. I was lying this entire time. The model is actually not complete. There's actually another element to super speed which we don't really talk about, but I would say is just as, if not more important, and maybe you can already guess what it is, and that is that we also have something called the brain processing speed. Now, I did touch on this briefly, this idea of brain processing speed, but this brain processing speed is pretty much the speed at which your brain processes information. And the reason this is actually relevant to us is because without this, speedsters would not be able to use their top speed. Okay, so to explain what this I guess looks like, imagine you're driving a car, right? So you're driving a car in a game, right? What happens is that if you're driving extremely slowly, right, you can see your surroundings. Like you can see the trees going past you, you can see the road signs, you can see other cars, you can see, everything, right? But what happens is that if you start driving faster and faster, aka your running speed increases, you struggle to process the information around you. I mean, this doesn't really happen like in a very a big way, especially like in a driving game, right? I don't really think you can really go that fast for this to really take effect, right? But maybe you could say that you would struggle to read signs, like what signs say, or if you pass some animal, maybe you wouldn't recognize what it is. Now again, this would happen at extremely high speed, so probably higher than what a driving game is capable of actually showing you, right? But that's pretty much the principle, that your processing speed is at this level, right? But your running speed is increasing, and the larger the gap between these two, the harder it is for you to actually process the information around you. And this is why speedsters, who actually live on this idea of traveling at like 1 trillion kilometers per hour, right? They need to have processing speeds which you can actually match their, I guess, running speeds, or I guess more specifically the top running speed. Now, we actually see this idea a lot in fiction. Like there are a lot of examples where we actually see this idea of processing speed being portrayed like this, or this. And when we see them actually being portrayed, they're usually portrayed in this idea of time basically slowing down. So basically time is slowing down around them, or I guess that is somehow how the power works, right? But for our purposes, what we can say is that whenever we see this happen, it pretty much means that the character is just thinking really fast. So it's not like they're actually slowing down time, it's just that they are processing information at such a fast rate that the world is moving in a more slowed down state, so their brain processing speed is just really high. Because of this, we can also add this to our model as well. So I guess we can make another graph with our processing speed underneath our running speed as well. Okay, so next there are two main points that I want to discuss that are very important as they relate to how these two things are actually connected. Firstly, it is that your processing speed needs to be somewhat similar to your running speed, and secondly, your processing speed only really matters after a certain threshold. So I'll talk about the second point first, right? Okay, so what this essentially means is that your processing speed doesn't really matter if your top speed is under the speed limit. So this, I guess, goes back to the limit that we defined earlier, right? And when I say it doesn't matter, it means that our processing speed can be pretty much the same as like an average human. So for example, right, let's say we were running at 100 kilometers per hour, right, and we had the processing speed of a regular human. Now, I don't really know what the brain processing speed of a regular human is, right? I don't know what kind of, I guess, top speeds we can handle, right? But the crucial part here is that if you were to assume that it is related to our, I guess, running speed, right, we can still handle, I guess, traveling at speeds much higher than this, because we can, like, I guess, travel in planes, jets, and supercars, and those can obviously go much faster than 100 kilometers per hour. You could say we struggle to process information if we are traveling at very high distances, but the main point that I'm trying to make is that if our top speed is under the, I guess, limit threshold, right, then our processing speed can be pretty much, I guess, a non-factor. On the other hand, if our top speed was like, I don't know, like 1 million kilometers per hour, then we would actually start worrying about what our processing speed is, and then we would actually start thinking about, oh, we need to have it much higher than, I guess, 100 kilometers per hour. Okay, so let's talk about the first point next, and this essentially means that your processing speeds does not need to be in a one-to-one relationship with your running speed. So for example, right, if you were to say that your top speed is like 500,000 kilometers per hour, right, that does not necessarily mean that your processing speed also needs to be 500,000 kilometers per hour, which pretty much means that your processing speed can only handle all running speeds up to 500,000 kilometers. So these don't need to be one-to-one the same, and instead of that, they can kind of, I guess, be around the same ballpark. So if our top running speed was 500,000 kilometers, you could have the brain processing speed be like 10% of under or over that top speed. And the reason I say this is because this actually comes down to a earlier point I made about humans, I guess, sitting in supercars and traveling at whatever speed they want to, right? Which is that as you increase the speed, right, as you increase the top speed, your processing speed struggles to keep up. But it's not like your brain just like completely shuts down. Like, it's not like you just die instantly if you start running at a speed much higher than what your brain can actually handle, right? And it is because of this very fact that the brain processing speed does not need to be exactly the same as the running speed. Okay, so that was a massive tangent, right? So let's move on. Now, let's quickly recap what we have got here. So we have a processing speed, and then it's to be linked to our top speed, but it doesn't need to be in a one-to-one relationship with it. And if our top speed is like around 100 kilometers per hour, then the processing speed doesn't really matter. Now, let's actually create an example to think about what this would look like. So let's say we have some super speed character, And let's say that the top speed was like 700,000 kilometers per hour and their processing speed was like 670,000 kilometers per hour. And again, this would mean that they can handle speeds up to 670,000 kilometers per hour. Now, if you were to do this, you can imagine that if the character was running at the top speed, they're in this slow motion effect. But you would notice that as they were to decrease the running speed, right, their processing speed would still remain the same. And even when the character is pretty much standing still, like, right, their processing speed would still remain the same, which pretty much means that they are forever stuck in this slow motion state. And this is a problem, and this is pretty much the problem with superspeed, that the superspeed is not really this one single power. It is kind of a collection of powers that are kind of working together to create the effect of superspeed. And in this collection would be things that I talked about before, like, right, like the ability to perceive your speed, your body's ability to actually handle your speed, and also your speed itself. But it will also include a bunch of other stuff as well, like your stamina, your durability, and also stuff like how do you actually turn on and off this power. And in this particular case, right, if you actually think about how the perception speed relates to the running speed, things get a little bit complicated. Now, you could say that I am the one who made the mistake here, because in this particular case, right, I purposely let the perception speed remain static, right, like because I defined it as being static, so it doesn't move, right. And if you wanted this model to actually work for most speedsters, because most speedsters don't actually see the world in slow motion, right, you can just let the perception speed change over time, right. And that is also not even that hard to do, because you could just link the perception speed with the current running speed. But there are a couple of things that are kind of wrong here. Okay, so first of all, this model actually does encode the behavior of some speedster characters, right, because there actually are some characters who see the world in slow motion. So characters like Red Rush and Quicksilver from the comics, they're actually stuck in this slow motion state, right. So this model actually does work for some speedsters, right. I would argue that there would probably be more than just like a couple, because I think it's just hard to write a character who's overstuck seeing the world in slow motion, right. But my point is that this model actually does encode the behavior of some speedsters, right. Secondly, you could say that, okay, so to fix it, right, is actually not really that hard. All you have to do is that you should just let the perception speed move alongside the current running speed, right. And if you did that, then it would actually encode the behavior of most speedsters like Sonic the Hedgehog or the Flash, and pretty much most speedsters, right. And this is also kind of wrong, because first of all, doing that doesn't actually fix the problem, right. Letting the perception speed change alongside the running speed doesn't actually fix the problem. And this might seem a bit weird, but the reason I say that is because if you do that, what this also pretty much means is that the speedster character can't actually use a heightened perception without actually running, right. So scenes like this or this or this or this don't actually work, because it pretty much means that the character can only use the heightened perception if they're actually running really fast, right. Now, because of these two things, right, you could actually make the case that keeping the perception speed static is actually the default case, because in this case you are talking about superspeed in the purest sense of the word, where you're strictly talking about only the speed aspect of it, right, and only trying to change that. Because as soon as you start to think about how the perception speed changes over time, you realize that it's a little bit more complicated than just linking the two of them together. Now, knowing this, how would you actually fix this model? How would you actually adapt this model to actually work with pretty much most other speedsters, right? How would you actually do that, if not by linking this current speed and the perception speed together? Okay, so let's try to do that. So let's think about what it is that we actually want. So first of all, we want to be able to enter the heightened perception state without actually running, right? And secondly, we need to make sure that our current speed is not more than the current perception speed. And this pretty much comes back to what I said earlier, that if the gap between the current speed and the perception speed is too high, then your brain can't actually keep up with your speed, so it just start crashing into obstacles and stuff, right? Technically, it should be like 20% under or over, right? So like I said before, that the perception speed only needs to be around the current speed, like it doesn't need to be in a one-to-one relationship, right? So knowing that, let's just say that for the sake of simplicity, the current speed cannot be more than 20% more than the current perception speed, right? So those are the two requirements. Now, if we did that, then we have pretty much fixed this model, or I guess we have adapted this model to work for every other speedster, right? So if we do that, then I guess it pretty much works. Now let's actually take a step back, right? Let's actually take a step back and think about what we've done. So first of all, we have our first model, which pretty much encodes the behavior of a couple of speedsters who are overstuck in this slow motion state. Then we have the second model, which is the one we just made, and we would actually have a third model as well, which would basically just be every other character, right? So this pretty much goes back to what I said earlier, that if your running speed is not that high, then your perception speed is pretty much negligible, right? So here you would have characters like Dash from The Incredibles, right? Now, this is all fine, right? This is all fine. But if you look at the second model, right, you would notice that it's kind of weird. Usually when we talk about super speed as the power, we usually put a lot of focus on the speed aspect of it, right? Like how fast the character can run. But if you look at the second model that we have made, we have put more focus on the perception speed itself. As in, like, the perception speed is actually what's most important here. I mean, the current running speed can only go as high as the current perception speed is, right? And it's the perception speed that actually moves first, not really the running speed. So the running speed pretty much comes second only to the perception speed. So perception speed is actually the most important thing here, right? And again, this is not really like super speed at all, because super speed, when we think about super speed, we mostly talk about the speed aspect of it, right? So you could say that we have pretty much started to go away from the discussion of super speed itself. I mean, to be honest, you could even make the argument that the first model and the third model are actually more to do with super speed than the second model, because this is kind of just like talking about the perception speed being the most important thing. And you could even argue that the power that the second model is actually talking about is actually a different power altogether. And this is actually where we have come full circle, right? Because the power that I'm actually talking about in the second model is actually the power that I teased at the beginning of the video, right? So at this point in the video, I feel like I can just tell you guys what this power that I teased at the beginning of the video is. And this power, which applies to only the second model, is not really super speed. And most characters who use this aren't actually using super speed. They're actually using time manipulation instead. Okay, so before I talk about my third and final point, I want to spend some time actually talking about what I mean by time manipulation. Okay, so first of all, when I say time manipulation, I only mean the ability to slow down and then speed up time. But even then, it is a little bit more specific, because you can slow down the time of things around you, right? And then after you do that, you can speed it back up. And this is the, I guess, order of things that you can do. So you can't speed it up first, then slow it down, because that would mean that you're actually going much slower for everyone else. Now, to give you an understanding of what this, I guess, looks like, imagine that you have some character, right? And they were to slow down time around them by a factor, right? By some factor. Let's say that factor is 500. Now, what this essentially means is that to you, any action that you perform would look like that you perform it 500 times faster. So if you were to, I guess, go on about your day, right, running at like 10 kilometers per hour, to the outside observer, it looked like you ran at 10 times 500 kilometers per hour. And finally, if you, I guess, also look at the other part of the model that's important here, is the ability to use your perception speed without actually running. Thinking about it as time manipulation also solves that need as well, because you don't actually need to run in order for you to use your power, right? You can just slow down time and just stand still, right? By doing that, you can still perceive things to be slower, right? Which is why it's pretty much time manipulation. So I guess my argument is that the second model that we have, looks an awfully like the power of time manipulation. Okay, so far I've only already talked about the mental aspect of it. So let's now talk about the body aspect of super speed. Now, if a speedster wants to use the power, there are two very important things that they need. First of all, they need to be able to handle the speeds, right? So their body can actually handle the speeds that they subject the body to. So this relates to things like durability. But it's actually not just durability, it would also be things like can your joints, or I guess limbs, can they actually move that fast, right? Like for example, right, if you have some super speed character and they're running really fast, right, they will need to alternate the legs extremely fast. That's why the joints and I guess all the body parts, everything needs to handle all of those immense forces and have the capability of actually moving that fast, right? And secondly, there is always a little bit of a delay when the brain sends a signal to some body part and the body part actually acts on the signal, right? So for example, if I were to tell myself to stand up, right, I would have the thought in my head and then afterwards I would stand up. Or if I was in a car and I basically had the thought of accelerating, I would think about accelerating, then I would put my foot on the pedal, right? And for a speedster, they also need to minimize this latency between the brain and the body as much as possible. Now, these are the two things that are very important for a speedster, right? As it relates to the body aspect. Now, with that said, right, after you, I guess, say that, you could add this to our super speed model as well. So you could have the super speed, the perception speed, and this as well. And normally you would think about how this actually relates back to both the speed and also the perception speed as well, right? Like we did in the second part. And there would be a little bit of a thought process on how this actually changes based on the, I guess, the user speed and all that stuff, right? But if you liken super speed to just the ability to manipulate time, then your problem is pretty much fixed, because the ability to actually minimize this latency and also your body's ability to handle, I guess, any forces applied to it can be pretty much summed up by saying that those capabilities are also multiplied by a factor of 500 as well. And if you do that, you don't have to worry about how this actually relates back to the perception speed and the running speed, right? And that's pretty much all there is to it. If you just think about super speed as just time manipulation, it really helps to unify a lot of the components of the power, components which before were pretty separated and acted as distinct powers, right? And again, this would only really work for the second model, because this is the one that says that you want to separate the perception speed from the running speed. Now, to be honest, this does actually make a lot of sense. This theory actually makes a lot of sense, because when we actually see super speed being portrayed in most media, it's usually shown in this very slow motion-esque way, right? So it makes a lot of sense to say that super speed is just slowing down time. But to be honest, this is not really the end of the discussion, because even though I said that super speed is just time manipulation, they are technically two distinct powers. And so because of that, there are some problems with this theory. Some problems which hinder this theory from actually working. So let's talk about them. Okay, so first of all, I want to start by saying that what I'm showcasing here is not really like a new idea. Like, I'm not the first person in the world to, come up with this, right? I would imagine that you probably have thought about this yourself to some extent, right? Or I guess if you just do a Google search on this, you will see that it comes up with a lot of results with a lot of people, I guess, talking about this. And if you, I guess, think about it as well, you realize there are some problems with saying this, I guess, making this equivalence. Firstly, there will be the question of aging, and I think this is probably the biggest problem with this theory, because a time manipulation speedster would actually age faster than a traditional speedster, because they are speeding up. So they're not speeding up their own time, but they're slowing down the time of everything around them, which means that if you were to, I guess, transform everything back to real time for the outside observer, you would actually come across as moving faster. So because of that, you should actually age faster as well. You could also talk about stamina as well, because even though you are performing things faster, right, the extent of those actions will still be limited by how much energy your body has, right? Like, for example, if you could run across the entirety of Australia before, I guess, tiring out, right, then if you have this time slowing down power, it doesn't only mean that you can run like a further distance, right? Because you would still tire out at the same time. Another issue is that you would have to think about how the physics of this works. Now, this is kind of a weird one, because truth be told, you don't actually have to like have a epic analysis that really, fixes everything, right? Because that's impossible. Even if you look at regular superpowers, they kind of hand wave away a lot of the logic behind the physics of it as well. So if you wanted to, you can kind of just ignore the physics of this. But with that said, I didn't really talk about the physics at all, so I feel like it does at least deserve some kind of mention, right? And finally, and this is probably the biggest issue with this idea, and it is the issue of durability, which is that the durability that I showed in this particular theory, right, this model, is actually wrong. Because what I pretty much said is that your durability scales with the rate by which you slow down time. But what that essentially means is that if you were to, I guess, turn off your power, right, so you're pretty much moving at a normal speed, right, it means that your durability is also reset to that of a normal humans, which means that if you want to kill someone who has this time manipulation super speed, right, you should just wait for them to turn off the power and just punch them in the back of the head and they will die, which is obviously wrong, because that is not really how it pretty much works, right? So this is also a problem with this theory. I feel like you could probably think of more, but this is the, I guess, main ones that I could think of. Now, I was considering talking about these problems in this video, but as I was thinking about them, I started to, I guess, think more deeply about this topic, and I realized that there's a lot of other stuff you could actually talk about. So for example, you could talk about whether the super speed element and the body's ability element, are they actually distinct powers? I feel like you could actually make the case that they actually the same power because they're both dealing with the body, right? Or maybe you could say that maybe super speed is just the power of super strength plus having heightened perception that you can turn it on and off, right? Maybe you could actually say that that is what super speed is. Or you could talk about what happens when a super speed character gets stronger in terms of the three models that are showed. So what does that process look like? Because strength in super speed is just going much faster than, I guess, another speedster, right? So in this case, could you maybe say that a character would actually promote between models? So like some character would start off as being model 3, but then they would actually move to model 2 if they became faster, right? So because of that, I figured that I'd just end this video here, because I feel like you can really extend this conversation much more than I'm showcasing here. And basically, if you want me to, I guess, make a part 2 where I talk about the problems and, you know, a bunch of other stuff that I was thinking about, then let me know. But yeah, that is the entire video. I hope you guys enjoyed. And I will catch you guys in the next one.